Everybody joining me on the show right now, Jared Redding. He covers Ole Miss for 247 Sports. Ole Miss, one of the teams that are one of the favorites in the SEC this upcoming year. And Jared, appreciate you taking the time, come on the show and talk about Ole Miss.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly, Phillip. Thank you for much for having me. I always have a lot of fun time. You and I shoot the crap every time we are on here, and it's a fun season to talk about. Just with all the crazy stuff that's happened in college football over the past year and change, and it's only gotten even crazier as it's gone on. And Ole Miss is in a position where they find themselves right smack in the thick of it, but they played the hand they're dealt, and they've been put in a position so far to possibly have, you know, on paper, what seems like maybe the most talented roster in recent memory. And, no better time when there's a 12-team college football playoff happens. But I'm sure Lane would rat poison me if I said that or anything along those lines. So we're just going to let it play out and see what happens.
Yeah, I guess he's going to have to carry that saying now that Nick Saban is now retired of the rat poison of the
He has,
coaches. I'm
he has
sure
to.
I'm sure Nick Saban will still say it on game day and all his media stuff from time to time. But yeah, as a
Oh, yeah,
coach, Lane's got to carry the rat poison mantra.
he does, especially this year.
Yeah, he's going to get some of it, and we may be spewing it here on this podcast, without a
That's what we're here
doubt.
to do, though. That's our job.
Yeah, that's it. That's our job. Lane, calm down. Uh, I don't know. Maybe this would be the one time I get a quote tweet from Lane Kiffin. That would be kind of awesome. Anyways, don't expect that to happen. But anyways, let's get kind of to the main stuff here on the show. First off, we talk about it. Ole Miss. There's expectations. Of course, you mentioned 12-team playoff. What is the level of excitement you are feeling from the Ole Miss fans going into this season?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that I've been asked a lot over the last 8 months and change. And when trying to find a word, not just any word, but a specific word for it, I think back to me having grown up in Oxford, Mississippi, and having watched this program for so many years, and since Eli Manning was the quarterback of Ole Miss, and think back to that and all of the ups and the downs and in between. You look at this year, I think the first word that would come to mind is unprecedented when it comes to the level of excitement, because, you know, one thing that we've learned with Lane Kiffin over the years is, that, try to create your own box. You don't have to do other things that other people do just because the way that they've been done before. But at the same time, when you're in a situation where there are things that are outside of your control, you have to maximize the situation that you're in. And I think Ole Miss has kind of been the poster child of that, especially in this new era of college football, and especially for a school like Ole Miss. Maybe they don't have the biggest alumni. Maybe they don't have the football prestige as some of these powers and all that. But you throw transfer portal NIL into the mix. It's kind of Ole Miss has kind of evolved itself into a almost like a minor league NFL team when it comes to utilizing NIL in this era of college football and of roster building. And Lane compares Ole Miss to the Green Bay Packers sometimes as far as their ownership model, that their fan base practically owns the team. And, Ole Miss has demonstrated that, and, supporting the Grove Collective and the amazing job that is done getting Ole Miss football to the point where it is now acquiring talent through putting themselves with a competitive roster year in, year out to compete with, some of the best in college football. So, and there was no better example of that this year. You go back to that Georgia game last year where Ole Miss had a chance to possibly backdoor their way into an SEC championship game and then getting gobsmacked in Athens. And, Lane would say it himself. They looked at that game and he was asked, what does it have to take to compete against an Alabama or a Georgia and all that? He said, simple. We have to recruit better. Our collective's got to be better. And, we need the things that they have. We need to have depth on the line of scrimmage. We have depth at every position. And, we need to basically emulate what these guys are doing, because now you can do it. And it was a call to action that Ole Miss fans and, the staff has responded to emphatically. And, now the thing that puts Ole Miss into this area of, contenders on paper, so to speak, is, depth at every single position, particularly when it comes on the line of scrimmage. Not to mention, key players from last year returning. Everyone knows about Jackson Dart, Trey Harris, Jordan Watkins, Caden Priestcorn. Guys on the offensive line with multiple starts. Jared Ivey, JJ Pegues on the defensive line. Tari Coleman at linebacker. And it kind of goes on and on and on of those guys, but that's not even including the guys from the number one ranked transfer portal class in the country, Walter Nolan, Prince Emil, Chris Paul, Juice Wells. You can rattle it on. And one of the best high school / junior college signing classes that Ole Miss has had in a while. So it kind of seems like it's the perfect storm Ole Miss right now. And I think that's why it's kind of been labeled the last dance, if you will, because it's like, I know there's going to be years beyond this one, but there's been no better time to compete for a championship while you're ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about just adding talent. I think that's the way we have to say it now with college athletic, just roster building, because every year is different. And Lane Kiffin won history as a head coach in the NFL. I think a lot of people forget it. I mean, Lane Kiffin probably would want you to forget about his time with the Raiders that happened. And then, of course, with his dad, he's been around the NFL game, so knows about, well, let's call it is NIL, transfer portal. A lot of it is like free agency. And Lane Kiffin has said much. He has not hid his opinions from it. So he has, I think, an advantage with it just because he's kind of been around it to a degree, just kind of the way it's done in the NFL. So he kind of sees how building the roster that way is also a big part of it.
Yeah, and I think he wasn't there long. Of course, he was in the NFL as very small, odd jobs. Obviously, a very early coaching career that predated USC, but and part of the roster management thing, even before the era, he kind of learned from Nick Saban as far as developing the roster from top to bottom as well. With the guys that you do have, that you don't just develop the top of the roster or get the guys that are 5 stars and just pray the other guys develop. You have to develop those guys too. And Ole Miss has had to do that, prior to all this stuff really kind of revealing itself as to be the new standard in college football. So, I think some of that plays into it, but also, using that pool that he has at his disposal wisely. I think, you know, he kind of understands the value in each position as far as what you can promise in NIL. And I know name, image, and likeness is part of the equation, but nowadays money is money, and more money, the better player. It's simple as that.
Yeah.
So that basically means you have to prioritize your quarterback. You have to prioritize on the guys that are blocking for him. Your running backs are great and all that, but you don't have to have one guy that you have to pay all the big bucks to. You can spread that out and basically, recreate the ideal running game that way. The value of, your defensive line and, your ability to have multiple guys in the back end that are interchangeable due to a lot of different things. So that kind of plays a big part of it too. Cause like I alluded to earlier, it kind of seems like he's kind of emulated like a minor league NFL team, the way that he manages the roster.
Yeah, it's just really impressive what he's done. And like you said, a lot of people don't talk about what he does in the high school recruiting because everybody wants to focus on the portal king and transfer portal stuff like that. He does a great job with bringing in high school players too as well. It's not just the transfer portal where that roster is being built, as you say, just top to bottom, different levels. Let's talk about the team, the players, offense. And I told you off air, I need to apologize for something from last year. Going into last year, I was not high on Jackson Dart. And honestly, way before that, when Spencer,
did you say this in the last interview?
I probably did. And I told you I'm kind of doing an apology kind of thing this week. So I talked Florida Gators earlier in the week here on the show. And I was not too high on Graham Mertz last year either. So I'm apologizing for some bad quarterback takes going in to last year. But I just felt like Jackson Dart was a guy that held Ole Miss back going into last year. I felt, okay, if the running game was going and he was fine, but I just remember the Alabama game from the year prior when the running game wasn't going, put on Jackson Dart's shoulders. He didn't play as well. Last year completely changed. The LSU game is a great example of that. Going toe-to-toe, Jay Daniels, clutch play after clutch play. The way he played, it's just, okay, Phillip, that was the game I said, okay, you are wrong about this guy. You need to apologize to anybody that will listen. But third-year starter, too, that's another thing coming in now. You got a guy that's got all this experience now. Is he going into his third year? We don't see this a lot in college football now, especially at, how many years he's been playing. We forget USC years, too, as well. Just having that guy, all that experience, there's not a lot he hasn't seen. That's a big advantage for Ole Miss.
Oh, goodness, yeah. And, the thing that people forget, though, was, that there was basically a chance to go to the NFL if he wanted. Now, granted, he would not have been a high draft pick. I feel like he had he had a little bit more to, prove, and the more film and the better and all that. But, he's kind of put in a position now because of the weapons that he has around him now, because he has a diverse run game that can basically ease the burden, if you will. And an offensive line, I think I read a number the other day, and I don't remember where it was from, that Ole Miss's offensive line, I think, has like across the board, across the entire roster, has the most starts or snaps. It's either one of those two, maybe even both, of any offensive line in the country or the SEC or something like that. So, and because you have that around you, plus you showing your ability to win and lead, it's kind of, he's called it his last chance because, I mean, obviously, this is kind of an all in year, but also like there's no better time to demonstrate, that you're a high value pick in the draft. But I think before all that, I think he wants to win a championship because I think the coaching staff would be the first to say that, when it comes to one player who basically recruited guys from this portal class, people said that Jackson Dart was, was just as important in getting those guys here. All the guys that you know about in that class, those names that I mentioned earlier, that was very much part of it. And as far as his game, I think, I think you weren't the only one that was kind of skeptical last year a little bit. I think it's just because, you know, yeah, he did turn the ball over a little bit at times. He didn't seem as confident the first year in what he was doing, but I think you saw that step that I think some of us who were optimistic saw, when Matt Corral was going to his second year as a starter, his
Mhm.
second full year as a starter per se. And some people expected that. And, you got that last year, but in multiple ways. I think what last year showed about Jackson Dart is, if you have to take care of the football. And Jackson Dart, I think, only threw 6 interceptions last year. Ole Miss led the country last year and had the fewest turnovers of any team in the country last year, and which also played a part of it in making sure the other offense has to earn it. But I think more overall last year showed how tough he was, because the ground game struggled very early on. And Dart basically had to carry the load, to carry the offense by himself, whether it be through the air and through the ground. That's why he had, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of 700, 800 yards rushing last year. I have to check that number. Let's see what it is right here. It was, okay, I was way off, but I was thinking of Corral last year, about 400 yards. But anyway, it showed just, and he carried the ball a lot. So, he had to basically fill a void that Quinshon Judkins and Bentley weren't filling early on. And they had some injuries at tight end, which also helped the background game improve last year. And there were times where he just got absolutely beat up last year. I mean, he was basically on one leg the last 4 or 5 games of the season. And, multiple times they say, okay, you're coming out, despite having some pretty capable quarterbacks behind him. Jackson Dart's like, no, I'm staying in. I'm going to keep playing. And, you couldn't take him out of the game no matter how hard you tried. And so I think that toughness really showed itself. He has a lot of toughness in his family. His father played linebacker at the college level. Jackson Dart was actually recruited by some schools to be a linebacker, believe it or not. That's what we learned through SEC Media Day. But yeah, I think, I think this year is going to kind of be the coronation, if everything else operates around him and if he takes care of his job. Now that he has helmet communication, it'll make that part a lot easier on him. I think that there's plenty of reasons you could point to as to why people are even discussing him in the Heisman Trophy conversation, so.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And you look at it, the top of the quarterbacks. I think a lot of people at SEC will look at Carson Beck and then Quinn Ewers, but then you look at Jackson Dart. That's another guy. Like I said, with talent, which I'm about to talk about. But first, I want to talk about running back. I think a lot of people that are not outside of Oxford just look from the outside looking in. You lose a running back like Quinshon Judkins going to Ohio State. You think, oh no, what's going on? I mean, how is that going to hurt Ole Miss? But Ulysses Bentley is a really good running back. They brought some guys in the portal. They've got some other guys there too as well. It seems like when you really dive into Ole Miss, yes, Quinshon Judkins is a great talent, and Ohio State got a really good running back. But Ole Miss should be okay, right, at the running back position.
Yeah, I think it's the common misperception for those outside of Ole Miss circles was, was basically that. And so a lot of the things that I've seen about content produced, not by us, but kind of by outsiders, when they talk about the question for each, contender on paper is, when you look at Ole Miss, they say, there's no Quinshon Judkins, so what's the ground game going to look like? Well, what people tend to forget, and, for those who don't follow Ole Miss or haven't followed Ole Miss in the years prior to Judkins' arrival was, so Judkins arrived in Lane Kiffin's third season as a true freshman. those first 2 years in Ole Miss has had a running back by committee approach, and in both seasons, they were number one in the SEC in rushing, and then 2000, and then they were one of the top 10 teams in the country in both of those years in total rushing. I mean, I think that some of that's a product of the way Kiffin runs offensively and Charlie Weiss. Well, Jeff Levy back then, but even now, just in general, how fast Ole Miss operates, how they beat you to the edge, how they mix it up, and how they use their running backs in the passing game to kind of keep them honest as far as what they can do on the ground. So I think obviously, it was some shock that it happened, but at the same time, we learned a little bit later about Judkins, depending on who you ask. There have been some that have said that there have been some stories out there that maybe he wasn't the best teammate in the world. Obviously, I can't speak directly for that, but that's kind of been the thing that's in the air a little bit. You kind of saw some examples of it in the Peach Bowl, offensive lineman refusing to pick him up. Jackson Dart telling his coach, hey, we got to get Quinshon out of the game at one point, but that's just basically on the surface though. And he was one of the highest paid running backs in the country last year, and allegedly he asked for more money, and Ole Miss was not going to give him that just because it's kind of the NFL rule. You don't pay running backs.
Mm-hmm.
But some of that stuff may have factored into it, and I've heard that maybe there is some credence to that. But I think afterwards, after a couple of days, I think they realized what Kim was able to do with running backs prior to Judkins. As long as you have diverse skill set, you have a power guy, you have a speed guy, you have an all-around guy, you have a guy who catch out of the backfield, you have a dual threat quarterback, and you have an offensive line. I think if you put all of those things together, I think the ground game can be as successful as it wants to be, so long as everyone else does their job around them. So obviously, yeah, you mentioned Ulysses Bentley. He gained some weight over the offseason. He kind of looks a little bit more sculpted in stature. So he was often referred to as a scat back, and he was. But I feel like he had a chance to be a little bit more of an all-around back just because of the way he's physically built now.
Mm-hmm.
But you have, Henry Parrish, who started his career at Ole Miss, was part of that running back trio those first 2 years, went to Miami, came back, when Kevin Smith returned. His running backs coach, by the way, hit that basketball shot that's going viral on social media right now. So having him back, guy who could run, catch, squeeze through holes, and then Rashad Amos, who started his career at South Carolina, was at Miami, Ohio last year, who was a workhorse and had a bunch of carries. So, what's it going to look like? Is it going to be a stable? It looks like it, but at the same time, Kevin didn't guarantee that. So maybe you might be a feature back. You might see Bentley as a feature back. You might see 2 or 3 of them. It kind of remains to be seen. But, you've seen, a lot of different things with the ground game in fall camp that suggest that multiple guys can get carries.
And it helps too. The passing game should be great because of the receivers. I mean, just if they only had brought back, Trey Harris and Jordan Watkins, that's great enough. But then you go out and get a talent like Juice Wells. In 2022 was an all SEC performer. Had some injuries last year. Of course, read some comments. Like when Ole Miss does travel to South Carolina, I'm sure he is not going to be welcomed back favorably. But still, you put those 3, what they have it tied in. I mean, you can't focus on any kind of running game at Ole Miss because they're going to beat you over the top.
Yeah, and it's funny. There's also some names too that weren't even mentioned that might be better than some of those guys out there. And, I'll explain a little bit, but obviously you know about Trey Harris and you know about Jordan Watkins. Trey Harris wasn't even healthy half of the season. Got hurt his knee in week 2 of the season against Tulane and nearly had 1,000 yards by the season's end. The way that he ripped LSU and Texas A&M to shreds last year with 2 200-yard games. He was kind of the home run hitter, but a guy who could use his size to catch 50-50 balls. And I think that's exactly what you want. And he kind of parts of his game kind of reminds you of Amari Cooper, if you will. He also has the same jersey number too, ironically enough. But Jordan Watkins has always been a very reliable hands receiver who always finds a way to get open. People don't talk about his speed enough, but he's a guy that, once he's open and you get out in the open field, he's very hard to stop if you give him room to run with. I think the biggest loss at receiver was Dayton Wade last year, who somehow did not get drafted last year in the draft, and the Ravens are reaping rewards of that now in the preseason. But Juice Wells, before his foot injury, was an first-team All-SEC receiver, first or second-team All-SEC receiver. Hurt his foot, got that surgery in Oxford. It was a Jones fracture. He was 100% by the time fall camp came around. He's been banged up a little bit since. He's probable to questionable to be ready for the next 2 weeks. But at the same time, if Ole Miss really needs him against Furman, there's a problem. Let's just be honest there. But people think the guy that people aren't talking enough about is Ole Miss signed the #1 junior college receiver and the #1 junior college player in the country last year, Deion Smith from Holmes Community College. He was one of the top receivers in the 2020 class. Started his career at LSU, but academics have been a hindrance over the last few years, and which is why he ended up at Holmes. He has not practiced yet. Part of that is because although he's cleared academically to be with the team, Ole Miss is waiting for a thumbs up from one of those previous institutions that he was at to just make sure that everything's okay before they accidentally play an eligible player down the line. So he hasn't played yet, but David Johnson, a recruiting guy now, we have watched this guy play, and some people said, if AJ Brown, DK Metcalf were meshed in a laboratory, that's exactly who you would get with Deion Smith, a guy who could catch 50-50 balls. He could run smooth. You could put a Coke bottle on his head and he wouldn't spill a drop. With the way that he runs, there's a reason why he started his career at LSU, was one of the top receivers in the country, but they haven't even gotten him yet. And Caden Lee and Aiden Williams are still on the roster. Both guys, Aiden Williams was one of the top receivers in the country. In the 2023 class, had a groin injury that prevented him from being perhaps maybe even a starter last year. Yeah, Caden Lee, who was an underrated hidden gem in that class, who only had 10 catches but earned a start last year, and was, if you asked anybody who's been the most improved player in the spring and fall, they would point to that guy. And as far as being able to play inside and outside and use his small stature to be shifty, get open, and make plays. And that's what we've done all throughout fall camp. So, and then obviously Caden Prescorn and Daquan Wright. Mm-hmm. Daquan Wright, you've seen this guy at the NFL upside of Virginia Tech. Caden Prescorn, when he was hurt at the very beginning of the year, and the ground game suffered because of it, because he's such a good blocking tight end. But as the season went on, he's like, you know what? I'm a receiving tight end too. And reason why he was the Peach Bowl MVP, because he just ripped Penn State to shreds. Just because he's so hard to cover and he's so physical. So it's kind of, who are you going to cover? It's pick your poison. So, but obviously, like I alluded to with running backs and quarterbacks, everyone has to do their job around them for them to succeed. But if you look at that room, you can make an argument that is the deepest room, aside from maybe defensive line, and quarterback to a certain degree, and and offensive line. So offensively, this has been the deepest that Ole Miss has ever been in recent memory on paper. And I don't say that lightly.
Yeah, you mentioned, I was going to jump to defense next. I mean, of course, you mentioned earlier, Jared Ivey coming back, had 11.5 tackle for loss last year, was MVP of the bowl game, all that good stuff on the defensive side. Yeah, J.J. Pegues coming back. Of course, I'm familiar with the guy that covers Auburn. I know all about J.J. Pegues. I'm glad to see him doing well there at Ole Miss. And then bringing Walter Nolan, a highly talented player from A&M. I'm not going to pronounce his last name because I will butcher it, but Princely.
It is Uman Mielin.
All right, you're the guy that covers. You're the one that covers them, so I'm going to let you say the name. But talented defensive end from Florida, and just up front, that's where it is in this conference. Offensive line, defensive line, you got to win those battles. And obviously, we talked about linebacker, bringing Chris Paul Jr. In as well. Going into the secondary, Trey Amos, another talented guy. I mean, it feels like to me, Lane Kiffin and his staff really made an emphasis on the defensive side of the ball as well when they went into the portal.
Yeah, and also in the high school class too. But obviously the portal guys are going to get a lot more shine just because, they've proven it at the college level already. Walter Nolan has proven himself to be, surefire first round, maybe mid-second round pick. Uman Mielin has been a consensus first round guy on draft boards. In putting them with guys who had a Peach Bowl MVP performance. A guy, J.J. Pegues, whose stock rose drastically late last year, especially when it comes to stopping the run. It kind of goes back to what I was talking to earlier about going back to that Georgia game. What did Georgia have? They had depth on the defensive line, and they just came after you wave after wave. And Pete Golding, when he came to Ole Miss, made it very clear that your foundation of your defense has to be the defensive line. Be able to stop the run, be able to dictate the line of scrimmage. And Ole Miss had an excellent front four last year because they led the nation in sacks with about 3 weeks left in the regular season, which kind of tapered off because, and they just didn't have, they had depth, but they wasn't the depth that's needed for an elite caliber SEC defensive line. And I think they addressed that in spades last year. Walter Nolan's a big run stopper. Iman Millens, excellent pass rusher who could also drop back in coverage and be a linebacker if need be. Centarian Perkins, the freshman All-American last year, one of the top linebackers in the 23 class, played linebacker last year, flashed it, especially against Alabama last year. He's been working with the edge guys this fall camp as an edge rusher. Part of it's because of Iman Millens' shoulder surgery that he's still recovering from. He may or may not play week 1 against Furman, but Centarian Perkins, has basically a heat-seeking missile when it comes to his ball instincts and knowing where the ball is going to go intellectually. So he's kind of like in this position that Harold Perkins kind of finds himself at LSU. And so that's been awesome to see as well. Guys behind him, Xavier Harris, Jamarius Brown, Cam Franklin, William Eccles, two of the best defensive linemen in the state of Mississippi. William Eccles was the top 100 prospect nationally last year. Both in-state guys set a great foundation for that 24 class. So, that's something that they addressed. And I think you're going to see 8, 9 guys, maybe even more in a rotation, which kind of is hard to put them in sometimes because you face so many up-tempo offenses. But regardless, if someone gets hurt, someone's going to have to step up. And Ole Miss has the bodies on paper to step up when needed. And, obviously Chris Paul and then Kari Coleman. Chris Paul, Arkansas second leading tackler last year. Kari Coleman, underrated guy who never gets enough attention.
Mm-hmm.
And then TJ Daughtery, who has been kind of that middle linebacker who, transferred in late last year, but couldn't compete until the NCAA cleared him because he transferred in late. And then NCAA did away with basically all the waivers, all sort of stuff. He got to play in the Peach Bowl, and, he's put himself in a position to start in the middle of that defense and be the guy who people look to for communication and stuff like that. So that's your front seven right there. And, it looks pretty good.
That's a schedule. And I know there's been a lot of talk about the Ole Miss schedule, looking at it. There's no Alabama on it, but they do have Georgia. Get a return that game, and to get them coming in to Oxford. And just looking at it, they obviously have LSU on the road. I'm pretty sure that'll be a night game. I'm pretty confident, in fact, that will be a night game. Oklahoma, they're the team they get. When you look at the schedule, though, any pitfalls in this schedule? What's kind of like your thought just on where Ole Miss could end up at the end of the year?
Yeah, I think when I looked at it's funny when the schedule first came out around, I think, October of last year, the first thing that came to my mind was this is almost an identical schedule setup to 2022, where you open up against 4 consecutive non-conference opponents. You open up against Kentucky, and when you look at all the teams on the surface of, their expectations, what they got returning, whatnot, it's almost like it's ridiculously soft per se, or ridiculously easier than most through the first 6 games. And then you go to Baton Rouge, and that's when it gets ridiculously tough at Baton Rouge, a place that Ole Miss hasn't won since 2008, a place where Ole Miss has had so many records over the course of their perfect records of the course of their history ruined by LSU. 2022 was also the case in that.
Mm-hmm.
And then just a ridiculously tough schedule the rest of the way. So I think it looked identical to that. But as far as pitfalls, obviously, you have to maintain that focus and test yourself early on. So when you get to those tough games, how are you going to respond when you're down? When things aren't working, what do you have to do? I think that's a big challenge that Ole Miss is going to have to face, despite the first 6 games being considered by many manageable. I think Ole Miss fans still kind of get PTSD from going to Columbia, South Carolina in 2009, and the birthplace or the birth game of Sandstorm was that game when they upset number 4 Ole Miss on national TV on a Thursday night, which was just kind of jumpstart Steve Spurrier's career at South Carolina. I think talent-wise, I think Ole Miss is far superior talent-wise. At the same time, Columbia, South Carolina is one of the toughest places to play for any opponent. And I think a lot of teams can attest. Florida at the end of the year is Florida. The Swamp is always a tough place to play. think Florida, despite them being in the absolute murderer's row of a schedule that they're going to be in the very end of the year, they're going to come in ready for that one. Ole Miss is going to be, they're going to be coming off of a bye. At the same time, they're going to be in the middle of a gauntlet. So how are they going to respond when they go to the Swamp? Will they have to fight through rumors like they did 2 years ago? Will they have to have guys bang up and guys have step up? That's going to be determined. And then the Georgia game, I think, is the game that has been circled on the calendar ever since last year, because it's almost exactly 365 days to the point of that game. And that game was kind of, despite being a blowout, was kind of seen as the turning point, the catalyst for where Ole Miss is today, because they basically tried to emulate Georgia with what they were able to do. And that they're coming to Oxford this year. And I shudder to think what Oxford's going to be like that weekend, given the stakes where both teams can go into, and this kind of being the game that, is Ole Miss a national championship contender or not? Last year showed that they clearly weren't ready yet. Are they now? Are they ready now? So that's going to be the fun one to watch obviously for that reason. So, I think anything less than 10 wins is unacceptable. 10-2 likely will not get Ole Miss into a college football playoff, given the strength of the SEC. Maybe could. 11-1, you feel pretty good about that. 12-0, obviously, you could do it. But anything less than 10 wins, I think would obviously, or anything less than a playoff game, playoff appearance this year by most Ole Miss fans would kind of be seen as unacceptable, just because the way they went all in this year to try to win a national championship.
I was looking at the schedule, and I kind of brought this up when I was talking with Florida with a guest earlier in the week. September 28th. I think Kentucky is an interesting team this year for everybody who plays them. And I say that because we don't know what Brock Vandagriff is going to be as a quarterback. He was highly recruited coming out of high school. He transfers to Kentucky. He just, wasn't getting on the field at Georgia. Talented player, looked good whenever you saw him in games, but just, Georgia's got so much talent, not everybody's gonna get to play, especially quarterback. So I'm looking at Kentucky at a lot of different teams. This is just not an Ole Miss thing. Just a lot of teams. Like, that's got to be a team, I think, for a lot of people around the conference. Wait and see, because if he turns out to be anywhere close to what he was hyped up to be coming out of high school, I think Kentucky could be a solid team. That's between Georgia Southern and that South Carolina game. So just throwing it out there. Just throw it.
I do. I'm glad you did bring that up, because I think that's a very valid point, because it's more than Brock Vandagriff, because there's a question, but one of the questions the answer could be yes. I look at Deion Walker in the line of scrimmage. He's one of the biggest, baddest dudes in the middle of any SEC defensive line that, we probably could see this year. Barrion Brown, criminally underrated, as a returner and as a receiver. One of the most dynamic players in the SEC that I've seen over the last few years playing against Ole Miss. He nearly single-handedly beat Ole Miss by himself 2 years ago in Oxford. And that's the reason why they were so close in that game. But, and I feel like, they present an interesting point based on those guys, because they have a couple very talented individual guys. If this game were in Lexington, I would look at this matchup a little bit different. Yeah. But since it's in Oxford, a place where Ole Miss has won 21 of their last 23 games, those 2 losses coming when everyone thought the lane was going to go to Auburn, that's the thing that I feel like gives Ole Miss an edge, and why they are kind of early favorites in that one as well. But I agree, because I think Mark Stoops, there's a reason why he's the dean of SEC coaches now, because he's built a legitimate program year in, year out to consistently nip at teams' heels and consistently be in position to win games. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very, very, very fair point.
And I just think there is probably a handful of SEC teams that we look on paper, but we really don't know what they're going to be about. I think Alabama's another one. Look, people can say this. I covered a team and write about team Auburn. I think they wanted Peyton Thorne's good. I think Auburn could be a much, much better team than they were last year. You last year talked about Hugh Freeze. I know a lot of people in Ole Miss still think highly of Hugh Freeze as a football coach. Maybe not what happened.
I still do think very highly of Hugh Freeze as a head coach, and I called it too, that if you let his staff recruit locally, like Mississippi, they dominated Mississippi recruiting, and also had some good recruiting classes outside. And now you're seeing what Auburn is doing within the state of Alabama. I think they had like 7 of the top 9 commits in the state of Alabama, like state that is rich with high school football talent. If you let that staff recruit, and especially if you let them, if the collective is what it is, look out with Hugh Freeze, because Hugh Freeze, I can't think of any better coach than Hugh Freeze that players could run through a wall for, because players love him that much. And that's why he's been able to do so well with less sometimes, because, players buy into he and his staff year in, year out. So I know, Freeze gets the perception of kind of being frustrating sometimes when it comes to playing down a competition, but playing up to big games, whether they win or lose. But, he's been one of the best coaches in the SEC that just hasn't caught many breaks, and I think, he was in a very good situation at Auburn, and I think it's only be a matter of time before they're legitimate, SEC title contenders this year. And, they're going to take a big leap this year. I predict that right now.
Yeah, I've been telling people I believe they have the potential to go 9-3. I'm not saying they're going to do it. I'm just saying the way the schedule works, I think it can happen with them. And you talk about playing, just look what happened against Alabama and Georgia last year. I mean, on paper, Auburn should not be in either one of those games. They almost beat Georgia, and they should have beat Alabama. So
they've been dang close to beating Ole Miss too.
Yeah, that's another one.
Dangerously close. They just ran out of gas in the second half.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to go down the Hugh Freeze rabbit hole, but I feel like sometime whenever we talk, somehow Hugh Freeze comes up.
That's my dude right there. I could talk about him all day.
So it's gonna be a fun season, Ole Miss. I'm looking forward to it. I'm really excited for them. And but Jared, appreciate you coming on again. If the people want to follow you, the viewers, the listeners, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter first off, or X. I call it Twitter.
I still do too.
At Jared E. Redding. That's my Twitter /X handle. It's still Twitter. To follow the social media side of things, you can go on to our website at insidetherebels.com insidetherebels.com, or go to 247sports.com. That's 247sports.com/college/Ole Miss for our Ole Miss team site, coverage of football, basketball, baseball, football recruiting, basketball recruiting, Olympic sports, and everything else in between. All the other Ole Miss content is on there as well. And we're preparing for a really big season. The site is in a position to be the hub, and it has been over the last few years, of being the go-to online community for Ole Miss fans. So if you're not a member yet, if you're an Ole Miss fan listener out there, encourage you to sign up. It's all hands on deck this year, and if this is the year that Ole Miss fans think it's going to be, we're going to leave no stone unturned.
All right, sounds good. Everybody go check out Jared. Check out all their covers of Ole Miss over 247 Sports. And Jared, appreciate the time, and I hope we can do this again sometime down the road.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.